Right, sorry, I'm just trying to start my slideshow. Okay, thank you very much, Chloe. There we go. Thank you very much, Chloe, and for the invitation to speak today. So, as she says, I'm going to talk about the creation of the world, which is sort of a standalone play, although it would seem to have been written as part of a cycle of plays as well. There's actually a note at the end of it which sort of says, you know, come back tomorrow for the next part. We don't have that next part. It'd be quite nice to find that one day. So I'm going to talk a little bit about its likely date of composition and what that can tell us about post-Reformation belief in Cornwall and how that links together. So Cornwall's rich history of medieval religious drama is almost unrivaled in England, although it's perhaps less well known than the contemporary York and Chester mystery play cycles. The Cornish mystery plays, so the three-part Ordinalia, Origo Mundi, Passio Christi and Resurrectio Domini, and the miracle plays Bunan's Merry Isaac and Bunan's Kay, were used, as with other dramas written in the same period, to illustrate biblical teachings to an illiterate population, and thus were written in the vernacular, so in this case, Cornish. To our best knowledge, as I know Oliver Padell discussed earlier in the year, the plays and a passion poem, Pascanaganaloth, dating from this medieval period, and also written to entertain and teach an illiterate audience about the events of Holy Week, were written at Glasney College in Penryn. And Glasney was the key centre of learning in Cornwall during the medieval period. Rather than being a monastery, it was a collegiate church and housed secular canons instead of monks. We know from the length of the extant plays that they were staged over several days, and that as well as forming the intended audience, the local population also performed the drama. So the creation of the world, which is also known as Grian Zambis in Cornish, is a further mystery play written in Cornish. Its only source is a manuscript from the Bodleian Library, currently in Crescent with the following colophon. Here endeth the creation of the world with noise flood, written by William Jordan, the 12th of August, 1611. Although there are questions regarding both the date of its composition and its author, it's generally regarded as the last surviving example of a mystery play written in England. Previous studies of the play have concentrated on the language of the play, its possible date of composition, and the relationship between it and the earlier play Origo Mundi from the Ordinalia. However, these leave many questions still to be answered. Not least, does the play reflect post-Reformation belief in Cornwall? Why was the play written in Cornish? Why was a mystery play written at such a late date? And was this an attempt to preserve a mystery play for posterity, or to slip a play with unpalatable ideas past censorship from London? Was Jordan himself a recusant? Paula Noyce is the lady who's written the key studies analysing the play, dating back to the 1970s. Her examination of the relationship between the creation of the world and Origo Mundi has been instrumental in understanding the composition of the play. Ben Brook and Ken George, continuing this earlier work, have shown through careful comparison of the texts that only about 7% of the creation of the world is actually taken from the earlier play. These identical lines only occur in 3 episodes in the plays: the creation and fall, the cursing of Cain, and the Noah sequence. More significantly, of the 178 lines, 127 are among the speeches of one character, so God the Father. Noyce concluded that the author of the creation of the world had had access to the actors' part of the earlier Origo Mundi, and thus had included these lines within their own play. There is evidence that actors in medieval plays would have their own lines written out for them separately, and those lines in the creation of the world, which are from the earlier play but are spoken by other characters, come either from the cues to speeches to God or occur elsewhere in scenes in which he was present. Therefore, the author had either seen the written lines or remembered them from a performance of Origo Mundi. Noyce's conclusion is that Jordan was merely a scribe, so he was copying a copy of the play, However, it's interesting to note that God's speeches in his manuscripts are marked by a hand, which you can see at the top left here. So was Jordan also an actor who performed this later play? So Noyce herself sounds a note of caution to her conclusions. She says, some of these differences in treatment, however, may be conscious alterations by the dramatist in accordance with his intention in the play, and need not necessarily militate against Origo-Mundi as a source for the episodes the plays have in common, even if the relationship is not as intimate as that for the three scenes, so the cursing of Cain, Noah's flood, and the creation and fall, where the lines are duplicated. Indeed, the many antiquarians who studied Cornish in the 19th century and produced editions and translations of the plays also conclude that Jordan was not the author, although this is because they believed the play was an altered copy of Origo-Mundi. Davis Gilbert, in his 1827 edition, does not think Jordan was the author. He says, I presume he translated it, more or less freely from some other language, not entirely sure which, since there seems very little probability of the work being original, as it nearly coincides in plan, in personifications, and in sentiment with others, which for centuries before had delighted all the European nations, enclosed within the pale of Rome. Gilbert goes on to note that the proportion of English words in play is greater than in the medieval plays in the Ordinalia and the Passion poem, thus making its composition more recent than these other works. Whitley Stokes, who was a Celtic scholar, in his 1864 edition, thinks Jordan was the transcriber and dates the play as being written in the period before the Reformation. He says, we may remark that the author imitates and often copies the Ordinale called Origo-Mundi. Some parts, however, are his own. For example, the fall of Lucifer and his angels, Cain's death, Enoch's translation, Seth's prophecy, and erection of the pillars. Who the author was remains uncertain. The William Jordan mentioned at the end may well have been only the transcriber, and the occurrence in stage directions of such forms as sortis, bistis, garmentis, seem to indicate a date prior to 1611, when Jordan completed his manuscript. The author's mention of limbo, too, may tend to show that the play was composed before the Reformation. So the antiquarians who studied the Cornish language in the 19th century did raise questions as to both the authorship and date of composition of the creation of the world, but without resolving either issue. And later figures from the Cornish revival continue to conclude that Jordan was merely the transcriber of the play, including Henry Jenner in his Handbook of the Cornish Language. Brian Murdoch, who's a academic, a sort of drama academic, analysed all of the Cornish plays in the wider context of late medieval drama. He concludes that the creation of the world was written in the mid-16th century. His work mainly focuses on the similarities and differences between the two plays, Creation and Origo-Mundi. But Bruton George's recent work in the last year analyses the rhyme schemes of all the Cornish medieval plays. And as Ken described in the symposium, they discovered that whereas the miracle plays Bunan's Kay and Bunan's Meriazic follow the rhyme schemes found in the earlier Ordinalia trilogy, only approximately a quarter of the rhyme scheme in Creation of the World follows that used in the earlier plays. So their conclusion is that the author of the Creation of the World cannot have seen the manuscripts of these earlier plays, possibly because it was written after the final dissolution of Glasney College in 1548. And this aligns with their other conclusions based on analysis of the language of the play, including that it was written after the mergers in the Cornish sound change of around 1525. The play also contains far more spellings in late Cornish, and this degeneration shows some of the decline of the Cornish language. So George's conclusion is that the play was written during the reign of Mary I, approximately. The play does contain many loan words from English. 518 of the 2,549 lines of the play contain at least one word in English, or borrow an English word and use it in a Cornish way, such as the mutation at the beginning of commandment to commandment in line 659. This is also an example of an English word being used where a Cornish word, arhachel, exists. Near the beginning of the play, Jordan uses the ordinal numerals across several verses. We find the expected Kensa, Trissa, Peswera, and Pimpus, so first, third, fourth, and fifth. But rather than the Cornish word Nessa, in line 51, Jordan uses the English word second. In most instances, Jordan's use of English is confined to single words. However, just under 100 lines of the play either contain more than one English word or the entire line is written in English. So lines 274 to 277 are written entirely in English. And it says, "For well nor woe, I will not go. I say you so, this will not be." Unlike the Ordinalia, where the character of the devil can be found speaking in English, perhaps as a device to compare him with the good Cornish-speaking characters, these words in the creation are spoken by God. And I've got an example for you here on the slide. Lines 1525 and 1529 both contain the same word, spelled O-W-N-E. However, in line 1525, it is used as the Cornish word meaning fear or afraid. So, awn imaddim abubden gansol the vonus lethis, which means I'm afraid of every man by him of being killed. And in line 1529, it's used as the English word own, paran ganzi own dula, just with his own pair of hands. In line 1971, the Cornish word gu, meaning spear, is used. However, in line 1995, the English word spear appears. These few examples suggest that the use of English in the play is not the simple case of Jordan, or whoever wrote the play, not knowing the Cornish word. We cannot know for sure when certain words in English entered common usage in Cornwall. Another possibility is that by this time, 1611, when the transcription was made, both Jordan and his potential audience, in comparison with the audience of the Ordinalia, had moved from being monolingual Cornish speakers to bilingual Cornish and English speakers, who were in fact beginning to speak or understand a hybrid language as the use of Cornish began its decline. We know Jordan was from Helston, which places the transcription of the play in a part of Cornwall known to still speak mainly Cornish in the mid-16th century. Robert Whiting, in his analysis of popular religion after the Reformation, reminds us that in Cornwall, and particularly in its western parishes, a further barrier was presented by the linguistic factor. To the Cornish-speaking population, literature written in English was certainly alien and possibly, as the Cornish rebels maintained in 1549, incomprehensible. But probably the most fundamental reason for the limited effectiveness of the written word as a medium of religious propaganda, either Catholic or Protestant, was the persistence of widespread illiteracy. Therefore, despite the conflict in the manuscript, the big conclusion is Jordan is unlikely to be the author of the creation of the world, and the likely date of its composition is mid-16th century. Although it would seem there remained a linguistic need for a piece of literature to still have been written in Cornish rather than English at this time, the question remains as to why it was written and then copied by Jordan in 1611. The creation of the world is a traditional mystery play. That the play mentions limbo implies it was written before the Reformation. When Adam dies, Lucifer tells the devils that Adam will not be brought to hell, but remain in limbo as ordained by God. In limbo bartha watha, ena ethera trega. In limbo above, there he will stay. The inclusion of limbo could follow on logically from the use of Origo Mundi as source material. In addition to this, the play also includes the story of the oil of mercy, which is not biblical, but is found in Ordinalia. Among those incidents which take place in the creation of the world, but not in Origo Mundi, only one is based on biblical materials. Most of the additions derive from apocryphal, legendary, or patristic sources. Even the one edition that is based on biblical evidence, the translation of Enoch, incorporates a great deal of apocryphal and legendary material. With the advent of the Reformation and the introduction of the Bible in English, were these sources more likely to have been destroyed during the dissolution of the monasteries and therefore not be available to an author at Glasgow or anywhere else to use to create a new play? And this also raises questions as to what messages the author was aiming to include in the narrative of the play. As in a morality play, there are sections where the audience is given advice, they're preached to. In addition to this, there's a strong emphasis on Marion Doctrine, which is a key feature of Catholic belief. As Noyce points out, the Virgin Mary is incorporated, apparently uniquely, into the legend of Seth's vision of the tree of life, while incense is used by Abel and Noah. These elements may suggest that the creation was put together in its present form before the Reformation. They might otherwise have been deleted, as for example, references to the Sacraments and transubstantiation in other mystery plays. However, they might equally well have survived from an earlier version, or, since Devon and Cornwall resisted the Reformation much longer than the rest of England, these elements might actually have been included deliberately. Thus, such material cannot really provide evidence of a pre-Reformation date, as Whitley Stokes thought. In fact, the defiant emphasis on Marian doctrine may indicate the opposite. The presence of Mary in the Tree of Life, for instance, has been added by the playwright to the legend, possibly in reaction to the Reformation. So if we look at one of the most famous images of this story, which is from Piero della Francesca's fresco based on the legend of the True Cross in the Church of San Francesco in Arezzo, there we can see Seth placing the pips in Adam's mouth, but there's no evidence of the Virgin Mary within the image, unless she's in the bit in the middle that's been destroyed over time. Okay. So one very interesting source in Cornwall, which could point towards dating the creation of the world, and whether it was written pre the Reformation, is the creation window in St Neots Church near Liskeard. Several features within the stained glass point to the artist who made the window having seen productions of mystery plays. In the death of Adam here, we see Seth placing the pips into Adam's mouth and nostrils, but rather than an image of Adam lying on the ground, as Piero della Francesca depicts the scene, Adam is in bed. So does this image portray how this scene was acted out in a performance of either Origin Mundi or the creation? Evelyn Newlyn, who's examined this window in light of the events in the plays, thinks it might, and therefore this could impact the date of composition of creation. The St Neots creation window was made and installed between 1580 and 1530 when the church was built. The image of Adam and Eve being tempted by the serpent shows a very human snake with arms and legs wrapped round a tree, as opposed to the traditional depiction in art of a very snake-like serpent coiled around the trunk of the tree. When the serpent is portrayed in pictorial art as partly human, the part that is human is customarily female. But St Neots' serpent has the face of a man, but with the tight yellow curls of a woman above his ear. I don't know if you can see that well enough. Since the sex of the serpent and the glass varies so strikingly from the traditional iconography, and since the drama actors were usually male, the serpent's presentation in the glass may reflect the casting observed in the drama. Another image is even more unusual. Cain is marked by God after he murders Abel, in order that no man shall kill him. The St Neots window, which depicts this judgment, shows Cain with a horn sticking out from his forehead. So perhaps this was a memory of a performance in which the mark of Cain was made obvious for an audience to see. The presentation of Cain with horns is not unique to the Cornish drama and St Neots glass, but at the same time, it's not very common. The motif is rare in art and is not found in other medieval drama that treats the story of Lamech and Cain. Although some Jewish sources give Cain a pair of horns, it seems fairly unlikely that the glaziers in St Neots knew this, and somewhat more plausible that the drama's costuming impacted the artist's presentation of Cain in the stained glass. So Evelyn Newlyn thinks that the depiction, this is another example, the depiction of Lamech's servant may have resulted from the creation. Although the verses of Genesis that concern Lamech's murder of Cain, which is chapter 4, verses 23 and 24, make no mention of the servant, dialogue in the creation refers to Lamech's servant by the word boy in line 1650. This casting of the servant, while again not unique to the creation, is uncommon both in art and drama. Perhaps here, as well as the stained glass artisans, Here as well, the stained glass artisans may be following the drama's characterisation, since St Neot's window depicts Lamech's servant in size and dress as a child. You can see him there in the middle. Significantly for us, in the dating of the play, Cain's death does not form a scene in Origo Mundi. So it's not that they've seen the Origo Mundi play. However, this is Paolo Uccello's fresco of the same event in Santa Maria Novella in Florence, and it also portrays Lamech's servant as a boy. He's on the far left there. So it's perhaps not as unusual as Evelyn Neelan claims, and might not impact the potential dating of the play as post-Reformation. So I'm going to turn now to what evidence do we have for religious conservatism and resistance to the Reformation in Cornwall? What events in Cornwall between the beginning of the dissolution of the monasteries in 1536 and the date of the manuscript in 1611 can show us what the Cornish believed at the time the play was likely to have been written? Due to decisions being made not only in mainland Europe, but also closer to home, English, but not Cornish, became the language of religion. These changes did not sit well with the common people of Cornwall. During the 1530s and 1540s, government attacks on the Catholic Church, a church which had always proved itself extremely accommodating of Cornish language and culture, reawakened the spirit of defiance in West Cornwall. This spirit of defiance culminated in the 1549 Prayer Book Rebellion. In January 1549, the First Act of Uniformity decreed that English would be used in all church services from Whit Sunday that year, which is the 9th of June. Cornish protesters, led by Humphrey Arundel, gathered at Bodmin, where they drew up articles of supplication to the king. These vary in number from 8 to 16 according to the sources, and were entirely conservative, concerned wholly with religious demands such as retention of usage with regard to baptism, confirmation, communion, and so on. But most significant, however, is the 8th article. We, the Cornish men, whereof certain of us understand no English, utterly refuse this new English. This was not merely a rebellion against changes to worship and liturgy, but a defence of their language too. The ordinary Cornishmen did not want another language to be imposed upon them, even if, as the Lord Protector Edward Seymour himself pointed out at the time, they would not have understood the Latin used in the old Roman Catholic masses they had experienced thus far. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, retorted that there were more people in Cornwall who understood English rather than Latin, but he was missing the point, for Latin was familiar, if not always understood, all across Cornwall, whereas English was not. Other members of the Protestants from within the Protestant movement could see that there was still a clear need for people to use Cornish as a medium of worship. Clear evidence that the advanced Protestant party in England was not opposed in principle to the use of the Cornish language for religious instruction emerges from a Puritan petition of around 1560. So this asked that children who did not speak English be allowed to learn the catechism in Cornish, and seems to have been drawn up by an extreme Protestant group. That the need for Cornish-speaking children to be allowed to use their own language received Puritan support is unsurprising, given the importance they placed on the individual's direct relationship with God. There's also evidence that Cornish was being used in religious instruction and services after the beginning of the Reformation, and that its use was approved by the Church. So as late as 1538, John Vasey, who was the Bishop of Exeter, specifically ordered that all or part of the Epistle or Gospel of the day, or else the Paternoster, the Ave Maria, the Creed and the Ten Commandments should be read in Cornish in those parishes where English was not spoken, which always surprises me because the Bible wasn't translated into Cornish. So how could they read the Gospel of the day in Cornish? Interesting. But this does imply that there are still many monoglot parishes within the county. The longest piece of extant Middle Cornish prose, as opposed to a play, dates from the middle of the 16th century and was written by John Tregear. He translated a series of 12 sermons by the Bishop of London, Edmund Bonner, in around 1560. The set also includes a 13th longer homily from an unidentified source. 12 have titles in Latin, the last has a title in Cornish. It's thought that Tregear was the vicar of Newlyn East, who presumably wanted his parishioners to hear the bishop's sermons in a language that they understood. Bonner had initially supported the Reformation under Henry VIII, but was imprisoned under Edward VI for opposing the First Act of Uniformity. Under Mary I, he restored Catholicism to his diocese, so to London. How significant is it, therefore, that Tregear translated sermons written by a leading Catholic who took a major role in the prosecution of religious dissidents? Did Tregear and his parish remain faithful to Catholicism throughout the post-Reformation period? Did they wish to do so, or were they able to do so in the period after 1560, and therefore created for themselves a need for the translation of these sermons into Cornish for their own scriptural edification? We know that as late as the mid-17th century, so moving a full century on, Cornish was still being used by members of the clergy in their communications. Around 1636, Mr. Drake, Vicar of St. Just, sent marriage banns written in Cornish to Mr. Trithel, curate of Senan. Again, in the mid-17th century, William Jackman, the Vicar of Fiach, was still using Cornish during Holy Communion because the older members of his parish did not understand English. It would seem, therefore, that the Cornish language remained a necessity in daily life throughout this period. Again, during a state visit by the Spanish King Philip III and his wife Margaret on the 20th of August 1600 to a Roman Catholic training college for English priests, the royal couple heard speeches in various languages, including Cornish. Only one student at the college was registered from the Diocese of Exeter at this time, called Richard Pentray, and he was admitted to the college on the 29th of April 1600. So it seems that, despite the Reformation, pockets of Catholicism continued in Cornwall, and therefore there was a continuing demand for men from the area to train for the priesthood and presumably be able to minister to their flock in Cornish rather than English, to cover both an ongoing linguistic need alongside the spiritual one. So those Cornish, it would seem, who kept their language, also kept their religion, which gave concessions to it, so Catholicism. The training of Cornish-speaking clerics such as Richard Pentray would encourage the language, or at least support it. In such circumstances, there was a danger of Catholicism becoming synonymous with language. We witness the result of this link between the Cornish and religious conservatism during the English Civil War, so again, mid-17th century. Civil War political and religious factors played an influential role over Cornwall and the language. Cornwall fell on the royalist side. So why was this? Well, two of the main instruments of power within Cornwall, the stannaries and the Duchy of Cornwall itself, were direct products of royal power and afforded Cornwall a degree of independence. These secular institutions, with their links to the Crown, might have come under threat from Parliament, and this in turn could have threatened both the economy and identity of Cornwall. The combination of the lack of Cornish translations of the Bible and the Book of Common Prayer and pockets of recusancy meant that Cornwall had remained religiously conservative, and as such, this Cornish Anglicanism, which had developed over the century since the Reformation, was now under threat from a Puritan Parliament. And we know that in Scotland and Ireland, attachment to non-Anglican faiths was, at least in part, an expression of national independence, of resistance to the military, political and cultural hegemony of England. When these faiths were perceived to be under threat, as in Scotland in 1637 and Ireland in 1641, religious and racial tensions combined together to form a sort of Molotov cocktail of hate. So it seems probable that in Cornwall too, a particular brand of religious faith, in this case conservative Anglicanism, was seen as an integral part of national identity, and that when this faith was threatened by Parliament, ethnic anxieties combined with religious ones to ensure that the bulk of the population fell in behind the king. So the principal academic studies of Cornwall during the Civil War were done by a man called Mark Stoyle, and he's carried out extensive research on life in Cornwall during the Civil War period, including the beliefs and the actions of the Cornish, as well as how Cornwall was viewed from the other side of the Tamar. He found that some pamphleteers pushed the view of the Cornish as dupes, ignorant rustics who had been seduced into the quarrel against the Parliament by royalist agitators. Others depicted them as quasi-Catholics, religious conservatives who are hostile to the radical Protestantism associated with the parliamentary cause. And this point was touched on in January 1643, when a commentator noted that the king finds his party is most in Cornwall, it being a place full of popishly affected persons. So therefore, if the Cornish were still religiously conservative a century after the Reformation, it's probable that they were so during the mid-16th century, when the creation of the world was most likely written. And likely or possible that Jordan might have been a recusant in 1611 when the surviving manuscript was written. So was that his motivation in transcribing the play at this late date? And if so, was this for a traditional mystery play performance by and to a group within the Helston area who still adhered to a brand of Cornish Catholicism? Richard Carew's Survey of Cornwall, written in 1602, as Chloe said, I think in the very first talk in this series, is one of the principal sources on the performance of the Cornish mystery plays. And he says, the Gwarry Miracle, in English, a miracle play, is a kind of interlude compiled in Cornish out of some scripture history. For representing it, they raise an earthen amphitheatre in some open field, having the diameter of his enclosed plain some 40 or 50 foot. The country people flock from all sides, many miles off, to hear and see it, for they have therein devils and devices to delight as well the eye as the ear. From the way this extract is written, Carew seemed to watch performances of these plays. He was born in 1555, thus well after the beginnings of the Reformation and the dissolution of monasteries. And even if he only saw a performance as a small child, that would place production in at least 1560. So well after the Reformation. Okay. It's also worth remembering that as a Celtic nation, Cornwall had its own traditions and particular saints associated with individual places, and that although this had been encouraged by the Catholic Church, it had a far smaller place within the new Protestant theology. Certain trees, for example, were reverenced on account of their supposed association with local saints. One at St. Breard was believed to date from Breard's death. Another at St. Delian was linked with St. Mick. A hill near St. Minver was honoured as the site of Minver's encounter with the devil himself. Veneration was also recorded to stone chairs in the churchyards at Jamoe and St. Maur's and on St. Michael's Mount. These were associated with Jamoe, the companion of Brieg in the early medieval evangelisation of Cornwall, Maur's, a bishop in Brittany, and Michael, who had allegedly visited the Mount in about the year of the Lord 710, and who frequently appears, as on the early 16th century Bench and Altenham, in the region's iconography. But more numerous than such trees, hills, and chairs were the celebrated holy wells. Enclosed within small granite buildings, of which a good example survives at Leneast, these were invariably connected with saints. Two at St. Endelion, for example, were thought to have been frequented by Endelion herself, while the well at St. Columb Major reputedly marked the place of Column's martyrdom. Within a geographically remote area such as Cornwall, such adherence and belief in the power of local saints, who were not only linked to specific places, but also gave their names to many of the local parishes, was not going to disappear overnight with the advent of the Reformation. So one aspect which is yet to be considered in relation to the creation of the world, in both its original composition and the production of the manuscript in 1611, is whether or not it was an attempt to evade rules on censorship and what could or could not be performed. In 1543, Henry VIII affirmed the right of all his subjects to stage whatever entertainments they pleased, so long as they did not meddle with interpretations of scripture contrary to the doctrines set forth by the King's Majesty. But it seems that the definition of meddling was not made clear. However, by Mary's reign in August 1553, for the sake of public peace, she issued a proclamation which forbade all interludes, books, ballads, rhymes, and other lewd treatises in the England tongue concerning doctrine in matters now in question and controversy, touching the high points and mysteries of Christian religion. So by writing a mystery play in Cornish, we think in the mid-16th century, was the author, rather than attempting to teach the common man about matters of doctrine, choosing to avoid censorship? And this is certainly one area for future research. So to conclude, the creation of the world follows at the end of a long tradition of miracle plays, both from Cornwall and written in Cornish, as well as those from elsewhere in England and further afield in Europe. The playwright, who would seem to have written it in the mid-16th century, uses familiar material, recollections of earlier plays, biblical and apocryphal material, to continue a means of both entertaining and instructing the local population in religious matters in a language they used and understood. The play is religiously conservative, but we know that the Reformation was not an instant event, and changes in religious reform and legislation continued throughout the Tudor period from 1536, not least in the reign of Mary. Evidence in the later 16th century and the popular Cornish reaction to both the Reformation and the Civil War a century later suggests that the vast majority of the population of Cornwall remained religiously conservative, if not Catholic in all but name. The creation of the world neither explicitly nor implicitly acknowledges the issues over which the Reformation overtly occurred, but it clearly deals with theological and doctrinal matters out of which these issues arose. As such, the play would seem to both reflect religious belief in Cornish society of the post-Reformation period and raise interesting questions regarding the levels of tolerance and the conditions which allowed it to be written and possibly performed, both when it was written and in 1611 when it was transcribed by Jordan. Thank you.